Picture this, a candlelit dinner, a table set with care, soft music playing in the background. It's the perfect meal made with love, the kind of night that makes you fall in love all over again. But as you savor every bite, a secret lingers in the air, thick and suffocating. A secret so horrifying, so beyond comprehension, that when the truth finally slips from her lips, your stomach twists in betrayal. Because the person you trusted most just fed you something no human should ever consume. It all started with love, a marriage, a promise, a dream of building a family together. They left Canada behind, settling in Oregon for a fresh start. Cassandra wanted a baby more than anything, convinced her husband that they needed one to complete their happiness. For a while, it was everything they had hoped for, a new life, a precious child, the perfect little family. But something dark festered beneath the surface. She watched as Lucas adored their child, showering the baby with love. Slowly, that affection twisted in her mind, morphing into a rivalry, a dark obsession. The very thing she had longed for became the object of her hatred. Until one night, with a meal prepared like a chilling final offering, she ensured she'd never feel second to anyone again. This case is one of the most chilling, stomach-turning crimes you'll ever hear, a tale of love turned to jealousy, of motherhood distorted into something monstrous. And trust me, it only gets more disturbing from here. Welcome to Crime Mysteries Uncovered, where we reveal the darkest and most unthinkable true crime cases. If you think you can handle more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because the truth is always far worse than fiction. They were the kind of couple people admired, young and in love, building a future together with nothing but possibilities ahead. Lucas and Cassandra Holloway met in college, falling hard and fast, and never looking back. He was steady, hardworking, and endlessly patient. She was passionate, determined, and full of dreams. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was strong, and for a long time, that was enough. Cassandra had always wanted to be a mother. It was something she spoke about with such warmth and certainty that Lucas never doubted it would happen. She would glow at the sight of babies in grocery stores, run her hands over tiny clothes in the mall, and press herself into his side, whispering about the family they'd one day have. Lucas loved her for it, her excitement, her devotion. He wanted to give her everything she desired. So when she finally told him it was time, that she was ready, he didn't hesitate. They started trying, and every negative test was met with disappointment but never despair, because they knew deep down their moment would come. When it finally did, the joy in their home was unlike anything they had ever felt before. Cassandra's pregnancy was beautiful. She embraced every part of it, the cravings, the swelling belly, the way Lucas's hands instinctively found their child when they lay in bed at night. He talked to the baby, read to the baby, and held her tighter than ever before, knowing they were about to embark on something life-changing together. They dreamed out loud, making plans, picking out names, envisioning the nursery they would decorate. Their love, which had always been strong, felt unbreakable. But reality has a way of shifting the ground beneath your feet. As the due date approached, things changed. Cassandra became anxious, withdrawn. The excitement that once lit up her eyes flickered, giving way to something Lucas couldn't quite place. He chalked it up to hormones, to stress, to the overwhelming nature of becoming a mother for the first time. Then came the move. They had been in New York all their lives, but California was an opportunity, a fresh start, a better job for Lucas, a new environment to raise their child. Cassandra was hesitant at first, but Lucas reassured her, "This is good for us, this is good for our family." And when their baby girl, Zoey, was born just weeks after their arrival, for a moment it seemed like everything had fallen into place. Lucas was over the moon. He held his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. He rocked her at night, whispered promises into her tiny ears, and marveled at the life they had created. Every little coo, every grasp of her tiny fingers, every sleepy smile made him fall deeper in love. But as Lucas's love for his daughter grew, Cassandra's eyes darkened with something else. At first, it was just looks. Cassandra would sit on the edge of the bed staring at Lucas as he cradled Zoey in his arms. Her eyes would follow him as he rocked her, sang to her, pressed kisses against her tiny forehead. She wouldn't say anything, she wouldn't move, just watching. She had wanted this baby, she had begged for this baby, so why did it feel like she was disappearing? Lucas still kissed her, still held her, still told her he loved her, but it wasn't the same, it wasn't enough. Then came the comments, "You love her more than me." Lucas had laughed the first time he pulled Cassandra into his side, kissed her temple and told her not to be ridiculous. "I love you both, you're my girls." But Cassandra didn't laugh. She stared at him unblinking, as if trying to see through him. I carried her for 9 months, her voice was quiet and flat. I almost died pushing her into this world. I know, baby. I know you're amazing, Lucas replied, but she said nothing, just nodded. The next time, her words were sharper. You don't look at me the way you look at her. You used to hold me like that, you used to kiss me like that. She's a baby, Lucas's voice was full of confusion. She needs me, and I don't, he sighed exasperated, pulled her into a hug, told her he loved her, and that was the last time she ever spoke about it. At first, Lucas thought it was a good thing. She had stopped making those comments, stopped rolling away from him in bed, stopped sighing whenever he held Zoey. But something else had changed. Cassandra wasn't herself anymore. She had always been so full of life, always moving, always planning, always thinking ahead. But now she was distant. She walked through the house like she wasn't really there, going through the motions of motherhood like a stranger wearing her skin. There were moments when Lucas would catch her just standing in the nursery, staring at Zoey's crib, unmoving. When he called her name, she would blink, as if waking up from something. She didn't laugh anymore, she didn't cry, either. She didn't complain about being tired, even when it was clear she was exhausted. It was as if something inside her had shut off. Lucas chalked it up to stress. Maybe she was overwhelmed, perhaps she just needed time. But there were signs, small chilling signs, that something wasn't right. The way she whispered to herself when she thought no one was around, the way she flinched when Zoey cried, not out of concern, but as if the sound physically hurt her. She never let Lucas out of her sight, as if she was waiting for something. And then there was the silence. The silence was the worst of all, because Cassandra had always been loud in her emotions. When she was happy, you felt it. When she was angry, you knew it. But now, nothing. She moved through their home like a ghost, quiet, hollow, her eyes never quite meeting Lucas's anymore. Completely unaware of the storm building inside her, he assumed it would pass. He had no idea, that her mind was unraveling in the most terrifying way possible. No clue that the woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, was already lost to him. The night of horror, the plan formed in her mind like a slow creeping shadow. Cassandra didn't wake up one morning and decide to do it. It happened in pieces, fragmented thoughts that stitched themselves together into something monstrous. At first, she only imagined it. She would be in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and the thought would come, what if I just... She would shake her head, push the thought away, telling herself it was exhaustion, but the thought came back again and again, whispering, growing louder, wrapping around her like an embrace she could no longer resist. One day, she stopped resisting altogether. She had been sleepwalking through her life, feeling like a shadow in her own home. Lucas had stopped looking at her the way he used to, he barely touched her, barely noticed her. Everything revolved around Zoey now. His whole world was focused on her, and Cassandra had become invisible. The love she once felt for her baby twisted into something dark, something unbearable. Every cry, every coo, every tiny breath felt like a dagger, piercing deeper with each heartbeat. So she made a decision. If Zoey was the reason Lucas didn't love her anymore, then Zoey had to go. That morning, Lucas left for work, kissing Cassandra's cheek before he walked out the door. She stood there for a long time, her hand pressed to her cheek, feeling the ghost of his lips. Then she turned and walked into the kitchen, moving with eerie calm, as if she was simply following a recipe. Each step was deliberate, each movement precise. She bathed Zoey gently, humming softly as she dried her off. She wrapped her in a warm blanket and rocked her one last time. As she whispered in her ear, her voice was void of emotion. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, not believing it herself. "It's okay, Mommy's got you. Mommy's going to make everything okay." She didn't cry, she didn't hesitate, she did what she had convinced herself had to be done. The smell of cooking filled the house, rich and heavy. She prepared everything with care, like a meal meant for royalty. When she was done, she wiped the counters, took a deep breath, and changed into a soft, flowing dress. She played music, something slow, something romantic. Then she waited. Lucas walked through the front door, loosening his tie, exhausted from a long day. The moment he stepped inside, he froze. The dining table was covered in candles, the finest plates set out, wine glasses gleaming under the dim light. A full spread of food was laid out before him, roast, stew, something fried, something grilled. Cassandra stood in the doorway wearing a dress he hadn't seen in a long time, her smile soft, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "What's all this?" he asked, eyebrows lifting in surprise. "A special dinner," she said, gliding toward him. "For us, for you." She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressed her lips to his, and for the first time in weeks he felt like his wife was back. He let himself relax. They sat down. The first bite was rich, deeply seasoned. "Damn babe," he said, laughing, this is amazing. I don't even know what this is, but it's incredible." Cassandra giggled. "I made it just for you." He kept eating, savoring every bite, the warmth of the meal settling into his stomach. They talked about nothing, about everything. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't distant, wasn't cold. She reached for his hand across the table, stroking his fingers as he chewed. But something felt off. There was an edge to her smile, a slowness in the way she blinked, like she was savoring a secret. The food, as delicious as it was, felt different. He took another bite, swallowing hard, suddenly aware of how thick it felt in his throat. His stomach twisted, and then he realized, he hadn't heard Zoey all evening. A chill ran through him. He looked at Cassandra. "Where's the baby?" Cassandra's smile widened. She tilted her head slightly, her fingers still lazily tracing circles on his hand. "You like the food?" Instead, he swallowed, throat dry. "Cassandra, where's Zoey?" Her grip on his hand tightened, her eyes locked onto his, and then she whispered, almost lovingly, "She's right there inside you now." Lucas's stomach lurched. He pushed back from the table so hard his chair screeched against the floor, his hands clutched at his throat as nausea surged through him. His mind refused to process what she was saying. "No, you're lying." Cassandra tilted her head, her fingers trailing over the edge of the table. "You always said we should be a family. Now we truly are." Lucas stumbled away from the table, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his plate, the food he had just eaten, the meat, the richness, the difference. His stomach convulsed. He turned and vomited violently onto the floor, shaking hands clawing at his own skin like he could somehow undo what had just been done. "Cassandra, what did you do?" Cassandra rose from her seat, slow, graceful, moving toward him with an eerie calm. "I gave you what you love the most," she murmured, her hand lifting, fingers brushing his cheek in a mockery of affection. "You said I was crazy, but now we're together. You'll never love her more than me again." Lucas's vision blurred. He staggered back, legs weak, body trembling so violently he thought he might collapse. His chest heaved with panicked, gasping breaths. His baby, his daughter, gone. His wife who had once been his everything, standing before him smiling as if she hadn't just shattered his entire world. Lucas let out a sound, a deep, guttural wail, raw and broken as the truth crashed down on him like an avalanche. And Cassandra? She simply watched, smiling, loving, as if she had just done the most beautiful thing in the world. The air in the house had grown suffocating, thick with the weight of horror, as if the walls themselves knew what had happened. Lucas stood in the center of the kitchen, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his body drenched in sweat, but it wasn't enough to calm the raging storm inside him. His breath came in frantic gasps as he stared at Cassandra, his wife, the woman who had once been the center of his world. Her eyes were cold, unwavering, almost satisfied. He couldn't understand, his mind couldn't grasp the magnitude of what she had just said, what she had just done. The words she had whispered to him so casually replayed over and over in his mind, "She's in your mouth." It felt like his chest was being squeezed by some invisible force. He couldn't breathe, he could barely keep his footing. He stumbled, his knees giving out beneath him as the contents of his stomach rose up, forcing their way out of him. He vomited. It was violent, uncontrollable, his body convulsing as he emptied his stomach, his eyes wide with disbelief, his heart racing in his chest. The room spun around him, and then, he screamed, his voice raw and broken. He looked at Cassandra, but the woman he had married was no longer there. In her place stood someone, something else, something unrecognizable. She stood there, unbothered by the chaos unfolding around her, her eyes unfazed as she watched him crumble. She tilted her head slightly, her smile still plastered on her face, as if the madness she had just committed was nothing more than a sick joke. With trembling hands, he grabbed his phone. The screen seemed to blur in his vision as he desperately dialed 911. Please help. My baby is gone. She's gone." His voice was frantic, filled with a raw desperation that sent shivers through the operator's ear. "Sir, calm down. What's going on? Where is your baby?" Lucas could barely form words. She's in my wife's food. She's in my wife's food, my baby's, she's gone. I don't know what happened. Please help me." The operator's voice was tight with urgency. "We've sent officers to your location. Stay on the line. The seconds felt like hours, each moment stretching into infinity. It was impossible to breathe, impossible to think. All he could do was stare at Cassandra, who stood in front of him as if she had just performed some sick, twisted magic trick. Minutes later, the police arrived. Lucas barely noticed them at first, his vision blurry from the tears streaming down his face. His entire body was shaking. He heard the doorbell ring, the rapid footsteps as officers rushed in, but all he could do was collapse to his knees. Still retching, still trembling, the officers rushed in, 2 men and 1 woman, all in uniform, their faces etched with determination. But when they saw him, they froze. One of the men, Detective Harris, approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. He knelt beside Lucas, trying to steady him, but it was clear that Lucas was in no condition to talk. "Sir, we need you to calm down. What's happened here?" Detective Harris asked, his voice low, professional. But Lucas could barely look up. He couldn't even bring himself to speak. The second officer, Officer Williams, began inspecting the scene, her eyes moving methodically over the room, the kitchen, until they landed on the dinner table. The sight that greeted her was enough to send a chill through her bones. A full spread of food, plates that had been meticulously prepared, steaming with heat, sauces glistening, delicate garnishes strewn across them. It looked so normal. The rich, mouth-watering aroma filled the room, but it had a sickening undertone now. Officer Williams felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She turned back to Lucas, his face pale, covered in sweat, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. He was mumbling under his breath, his words barely coherent. "What happened? What happened to your baby?" Detective Harris asked again, urgency creeping into his voice as he gently pulled Lucas's face toward his. Lucas's hands trembled as he tried to lift them, his lips quivering, his eyes locked onto Harris's with an empty, hollow look that told the whole story. He couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything except point weakly toward the food. "The baby, in the food." Lucas whispered, his voice cracking. "My baby, she's in there, in the food. Cassandra, she did this." The 2 officers looked at each other, their faces hardening. Detective Harris signaled Officer Williams to check the food. She approached the table slowly, cautiously. There was a sickening silence as she took in the scene. The dishes looked like a festive celebration, too perfect, too neat. But as her eyes narrowed in suspicion, she bent down over one of the plates. Her breath caught in her throat. There, in the middle of the dish, lay a piece of flesh. It was unmistakable. It was human flesh. Williams recoiled, taking a step back, her hands shook as she reached for the radio on her shoulder. "We need immediate backup. We need forensics. I think we've got a homicide on our hands." The shock rippled through the team, but there was no time to process it. The situation had already spiraled out of control. The third officer, Officer Reynolds, had been quiet up until now, but he stepped forward when he saw the grisly discovery, his face twisted in disgust as he stared at the food on the table. He turned back toward Lucas, his eyes hardening with realization. This is beyond anything we've ever dealt with," Officer Reynolds muttered, more to himself than to the others. Detective Harris moved toward Cassandra, who was standing in the corner of the room, her face eerily calm. He said, his voice firm, "We need to ask you some questions." Cassandra looked at him with a smile, as if she hadn't just shattered her husband's life in the most horrific way imaginable. "What's the problem?" she asked, almost sweetly. "I made a meal for my husband. Is there something wrong with that?" Her voice sent a shiver down Harris's spine. He could see that she wasn't in a state of panic, she wasn't crying, she wasn't even regretful. She was almost pleased. The officers had seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared them for this. The arrest was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Her cold demeanor was chilling, but there was no denying it, she had murdered her child, cooked her, and served her up to her husband. Cassandra was taken into custody without resistance, her eerily calm demeanor never wavering as they led her out of the house. The officers exchanged looks of disgust, unable to comprehend the level of darkness that had unfolded in that home. The horror would stay with them long after they had left. The trial of Cassandra was unlike anything the world had ever seen. What should have been a tragedy of unimaginable proportions became an even darker spectacle as the courtroom was flooded with shock and disbelief. A mother, a woman who had once cradled her baby with love, had taken that innocent life in the most horrific way possible. And the nation watched as the defense and prosecution clashed over what had driven her to commit such an unthinkable act. As the case unfolded, the defense attempted to frame her actions as the result of postpartum psychosis, a mental health condition, they argued, had pushed Cassandra into a state of madness, causing her to lose all sense of reality. The defense painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood, driven to the edge by the intense emotions that followed childbirth. They claimed her actions were the result of an illness that had consumed her mind, leaving her incapable of understanding the gravity of what she was doing. However, the prosecution wasn't swayed. They asserted that Cassandra's actions were far too calculated, far too deliberate to be deemed temporary insanity. The details of the crime were chilling, the way she had prepared the meal was too careful. They characterized her as a woman who snapped under the weight of jealousy but maintained the clarity to execute her horrific plan with precision. The prosecution's case was one of cold-blooded evil, a woman willing to sacrifice her child for her own twisted sense of control and power. Through it all, Lucas sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of anguish. He had been forced to relive the horror of that night over and over again. The image of his wife smiling, the words she had spoken to him, still haunted him, echoing through his mind at all hours. He had never expected this. He never thought his life would be shattered in such a way. The love he had once held for Cassandra had now been replaced by an overwhelming grief, a grief that knew no end, no resolution. As he took the stand, his voice cracked with emotion, his body trembling as he recounted what had happened. He spoke of his love for their child, his excitement over becoming a father, and how he had never seen the warning signs. He spoke of the last moments he had shared with his baby, the terrifying realization that the food he had eaten had been made from her flesh, that the child he had adored was gone. His breakdown in the courtroom left everyone in shock. The rawness of his grief, the devastation in his eyes, was a reminder of the unimaginable pain he had suffered. Cassandra sat across from him, her face unreadable, her eyes cold. She showed no remorse, no sign that she understood the magnitude of her actions. She was a woman who had once been full of warmth and love, but now, she was a stranger, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As Lucas's testimony came to a close, she offered nothing but a cold stare, as if the entire trial were nothing more than a nuisance to her. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, each juror struggling to come to terms with the horror of what had unfolded. Was Cassandra truly insane, as the defense argued, or had she committed a heinous act of murder, calculated and premeditated? They weighed the evidence, the testimony, and the overwhelming sense of revulsion that had filled the courtroom. Finally, the decision came. Cassandra was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury concluded that her actions had been deliberate, that the horror she had unleashed was the result of a mind that had broken long before the act itself. There was no mercy. There was no second chance. The sentencing was swift. Cassandra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were heavy with finality, and as the gavel came down, Lucas let out a soft cry of relief, but it was fleeting. The pain of losing his child could never be assuaged by a verdict, no matter how just. His world had been destroyed, and the reality of that would never change. In the days that followed, the impact of the case rippled through the community, leaving scars that would never heal. Lucas's grief was unbearable, a constant weight that pressed down on him, suffocating him in his sorrow. He would never look at food the same way again. He would never hear a meal being prepared without thinking of that night, without remembering the betrayal, the horror, and the pain. His mind would forever be haunted by the image of Cassandra's cold smile, the words she had whispered in his ear. The psychological scars were deep, not only for Lucas but for everyone who had followed the case. There was no escape from the darkness of it. There was no understanding of how a mother, someone who was supposed to nurture and protect, could turn into something so monstrous. It was a loss that no one could fully comprehend. Postpartum psychosis, while it could explain some of Cassandra's behavior, could not absolve her of what she had done. The act itself was one of unspeakable cruelty, and the consequences of her actions were felt by everyone who had loved her. Her mind had become a prison, one she could never escape, but the world around her would never forget the horror she had brought into it, and neither would Lucas. The unimaginable horror of a mother turning against her own child is something that defies logic and compassion. How could someone who had once cradled their baby in love, who had nurtured it through every stage of life, descend into such unspeakable darkness? The answer lies in a mind unraveling under the weight of deep-seated jealousy and untreated mental illness, both of which twisted reality and led to an act that no one could have foreseen. The chilling tragedy that unfolded is a painful reminder of how dangerous the human mind can become when left unchecked. The resentment, the paranoia, and the overwhelming emotions that plagued Cassandra drove her to commit an act so vile, so incomprehensible, that it will haunt the community and her family forever. This story exposes the depths to which a mind can fall when it is consumed by unchecked mental illness. If this story left you shocked, you're not alone. These are the horrors that exist beneath the surface of everyday life, lurking where we least expect them. These are the stories that should not be forgotten. The darkness is always closer than we think, waiting to surface when we least anticipate it. If you found this case chilling, make sure to subscribe to Crime Mysteries Uncovered and join us for more real-life stories that reveal the monsters lurking in plain sight, hidden behind the facades of normal lives. Stay tuned and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying new episode.